Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 2 to 4 player game Fast and Furious Highway Heist, designed by Prospero Hall and published by Funko Games, who helped sponsor this video. Based on the popular movie franchise, the Fast and Furious crew are once again being dropped into impossible situations that only their wits, fast cars, and harrowing stunts can overcome. Whether recovering stolen cargo from a moving semi-truck, being hunted by a chopper, or taking on a tank, you and the other players will be working to overcome the odds. So join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, place this road board in the center of the play area. Nearby, set the 5 effort dice, this enemy die, these boost tokens, enemy SUVs, and matching colored pegs. I have mine in some trays that I own, and if you'd like to get some for yourself, you'll find links in the description below. The game comes with 3 scenarios, and they recommend Tank Assault for your first game, which we'll set up in this video. First, take the related scenario board and flip it over. This will give you its special instructions, which we'll go through together. To begin, set the tank on these 4 spaces in the center of the board, and then set an enemy SUV onto these 4 spaces. You now set one of these enemy pegs into each of these 2 SUVs specifically, and it doesn't matter which of the 2 holes on top that you place them into. Now flip this board back over and set one of these gray enemy cubes into the tank strength space for your number of players. We'll be setting up a game for 2 players, so we'll place it here. Each scenario has specific enemy cards as indicated by their backs. You'll take the deck for your game and shuffle it into a face-down pile that is set to the left of the scenario board. There are also stunt cards for each scenario, so collect the related ones now. Separate and shuffle the stunt cards based on the level values found here, and then from the level 2 stunts, return 1 unseen back to the box, stacking the rest on top of the level 3 card. Then randomly remove one of the level 1 stunts, stacking these onto the rest of them. Set this deck beside the road board, drawing the top stunt and putting it into the space here. Then add boost tokens to any spaces showing for them on it. If you want to adjust the difficulty of the game, you can use this chart, which is included in the rulebook, to customize the stunt deck. I'm using the standard setup rules here, but you can make it easier or much harder. And now with the scenario set up, it's time for the players to pick and set up their characters. Everyone chooses one of the 6 character boards and one of the 4 vehicle boards. Your vehicle board has a hijacked SUV side, but this starts the game face down, and you set your 2 boards side by side like this. If you happen to pick the Tej character board, also take these 3 tokens. Now each player collects the player vehicle, strength cube, underlight token, and player peg that matches their vehicle board. You also collect 2 boost tokens from the supply and set them here. Your player peg goes on the outline spot for it here, and your strength cube goes into the topmost space of this track. Each player now sets their vehicle onto any free space of this highlighted starting column. All other player pieces and unused components now go back to the box, and many of them are used in the other 2 scenarios that you can explore in future plays. But otherwise, that's the setup. In Fast and Furious Highway Heist, you and the other players will be working together to accomplish the goals of the scenario. In this case, dangerous mercenary Owen Shaw has stolen a top-secret computer chip and is escaping with it. In a tank. Very easy to spot, not so easy to stop. And that's your mission. Destroy the tank. The game is played over a series of rounds, and during a round, each player will take 1 turn, and you can decide as a group which order to take your turns in. Then on the following round, you can change the order again if you like. Now on your turn, you'll perform 2 steps, starting with taking 2 actions. The game comes with a reference for each person, and you'll find a list of all 8 of the possible actions you can take on this side of it. When taking your 2 actions, they can be the same or different ones taken in either order. So let's go through each of the options you have, starting with the drive action. To drive, you have to be seated behind the wheel of your car, which the game calls having your vehicle manned. You see, during the game, you can actually jump out of your vehicle onto your own or even another vehicle entirely, and we'll see how that works later. but to take the drive action, your vehicle must be manned. As long as your player peg is here, your vehicle is manned and you can take the drive action. To drive, first check your skills area and you'll find 4 different types: speed, control, athletics, and defense. Your rating in each of these is the number of symbols filled into the boxes of that skills row, which comes from combining your character and vehicle boards. Dominic, for example, has a skill rating of 5 for speed. When you perform a drive action, you can move your vehicle up to a number of spaces equal to your speed skill. So Dominic can move up to 5 spaces, going from one adjacent space to the next. In the game, a space is adjacent to all 8 of the spaces surrounding it. So when driving, Dominic could move into any of these highlighted spaces. And that means now the car could drive into any of these spaces. However, you cannot drive through or end on a space with another vehicle or wreck. Wrecks are vehicles that are upside down, and we'll see how that can happen a little bit later. So maybe in this situation, I drive directly to here. Now you can, however, drive diagonally between vehicles. So in this situation, I might squeeze between this vehicle and this wreck to end up here. And you can also drop back while driving. When a car drops back, it's not going in reverse or turning around. It's more that it's slowing down. You see, the board represents the road flying by underneath the vehicles as they race forward at high speeds. So a car that is stationary is still moving, it's just going at a constant speed. When it advances, it's speeding up, and when it drops back, it's slowing down. I should point out, you can't drive off the front or back of the board. So if in effect whatever caused that, your vehicle moves as far as it can and then stops on the related edge. I had mentioned that all 8 spaces surrounding a vehicle are adjacent to it, but some card effects you'll encounter will refer to being directly adjacent to something, and in those specific cases, only the spaces directly above, below, ahead, or behind are considered adjacent. So that covers everything you need to know about the drive action. Next, let's learn about the force action. This is how you can use your vehicle to push other vehicles around the highway. To do this, you need to be manning your vehicle. That is, your player peg needs to be here on your board. In fact, for any action that uses the speed or control skill, your vehicle must be manned. Next, pick your target. And that can be either an enemy SUV or even another player vehicle, as long as it's adjacent to yours. And then you perform a skill roll. Many actions require a skill roll, and if so, you'll see the related skill and a value within a green circle beside it. This is the minimum number of dots you need to roll on the dice in order to succeed. To perform a skill roll, collect a number of dice equal to your rating in the skill that's being tested. For forcing, you test control. And let's assume Letty here is trying to force. She has a control of 4. So we roll 4 dice, but this action needs 3 dots to succeed, so this attempt has failed. Failing still uses up one of your 2 actions, but sometimes you can recover from a failed attempt. If any of the dice you rolled show this boost symbol, you may return one of your boost tokens back to the supply in order to treat all boost symbols you rolled as successes. So now I have 4 successes and would pass. That's not the only way boosts can be used. Before you make a skill check, any of the other players at the table can spend their boost tokens to add 2 dice to your skill roll before you roll. For example, if Dominic was trying to do a force test, he only has 1 in control and would only get to roll 1 die. So this will fail for sure. But maybe Letty spends one of her boost tokens to add 2 dice to Dom's roll. Now, there's a chance. Just keep in mind you can never roll more than a total of 5 dice during any skill roll, which is how many the game comes with. Either way, after the roll, if it's still a fail, Dominic could then spend a boost token to convert boost symbols to successes, as usual. So to be clear, other players can spend boosts to give you extra dice during your skill roll, but you can't give yourself extra dice. However, after you roll, you, and only you, can spend a boost token to convert boosts rolled into successes. So that covers skill rolls and boosting. So let's go back to discussing the force action, which we saw requires a successful skill roll. Assuming you were successful, you then move the targeted adjacent vehicle up to 2 spaces in any direction, following all the same rules for moving a vehicle when you drive. So we could force this enemy SUV just like this. Then, after moving the other vehicle, you may, if you want, move your player vehicle into the vacated spot. Though I should mention, you cannot move the tank with a force. Okay, next, let's learn how to perform the leap action. If your player peg is on your vehicle board, you now move it to an available spot on top of your own vehicle or onto any vehicle within your athletics skill rating. So with a skill of 2, like Dominic has here, it means I could leap to this player vehicle or perhaps over to this enemy SUV. Now, if you're already on another vehicle when taking the leap action, you could then leap on top of another vehicle that's within range, or even back into your own vehicle, if that's within range. And when you leap back into your vehicle, you just set the player peg back on your board. Also keep in mind, even if you're on top of your own vehicle already, it will require a leap action to jump into it. And your own player vehicle is the only vehicle you can jump into. All the rest you can only jump on top of. If there are no available spots on top of the vehicle you want to jump to, well, then you can't leap to it. And by the way, if you do leap out of your vehicle, it will continue to drive. Thankfully, this highway is very straight, and apparently you locked your steering wheel and acceleration in place before jumping out. But why leap out of a vehicle in the first place? Well, as you saw, enemy pegs can end up on the tops of cars, and sometimes they'll jump onto player vehicles, as we'll see later. And while they're there, they can cause damage. So it's good to knock them off, which you can do with the Brawl action. For this action, your player peg needs to be on a vehicle with an enemy peg. Then you perform an athletics skill roll and need to get 2 dots. If you fail, nothing happens. But if you succeed, remove the enemy peg from the vehicle and return it to the supply. You can also try to get an enemy peg off your own vehicle if you're manning your vehicle and use the shake action. This requires a speed skill roll of at least 2 dots, and if successful, you again return the enemy peg back to the supply. And by the way, if any player pegs were also on your car, they don't get shaken off. Only enemies are affected by this action. Okay, next, let's look at another reason you might jump out of your vehicle with the next action known as hijacking an enemy SUV. This will require having your player peg on top of an enemy SUV and then performing a successful athletics skill roll, gaining at least 2 green dots. You then place your underlight token under that SUV. This makes it clear that this is not an enemy SUV anymore, but this is now your vehicle. You also flip your vehicle board to the other side, which changes your skill ratings based on its symbols here. And then you move your player peg from the top of that SUV over to this board. And this shows you're now manning this vehicle. You also set this cube into the top slot. So even if it had been further down when you take over a new vehicle, it goes directly to the top. Once you hijack an enemy SUV, your player vehicle, if it's still on the highway, will stay there, but you can never use it as a player vehicle again. You can't, for example, hijack it back, though pegs can still leap on top of it. That said, the SUV that you hijacked, which you put your underlight under, is now considered your player vehicle. So you can leap out of it and then leap back into it, just as you could have with your original player vehicle. Later, if you leap out of your hijacked SUV onto a new one, and then successfully hijack that new one, just move your underlight token to the new vehicle, place your peg back onto the board, and reset your vehicle strength to the top of the track, as this is considered a fresh SUV. I should probably mention, you cannot hijack the tank. I know some of you are planning on trying. The main reason you'd hijack an enemy SUV is to reset your vehicle strength when your current vehicle's is getting low. Because if your vehicle strength ever reaches 0, it becomes a wreck, which we'll learn about later. And speaking of which, let's move on to the next action, ramming an enemy SUV. First, pick an SUV adjacent to your manned vehicle and perform the required speed skill roll. You'll need 3 or more dots to succeed, and if so, your target is wrecked. Your vehicle doesn't change position, but your target is flipped over in place. When a vehicle is wrecked, whether it's an enemy SUV or yours or another player's, it stops being a player vehicle or an enemy vehicle and is just referred to as a wreck. Also, pegs cannot be on or moved to a wreck. Let's say this SUV had just been wrecked. If there was an enemy peg on top of it, it first moves to an adjacent vehicle with an available spot. However, you cannot have more than one enemy peg on top of the same vehicle, so we could not move this peg over to here. If there's more than one option, the peg will always move to a player vehicle first, targeting the active player's vehicle if possible, but as we saw, this is not an option. So this peg would instead go here. Now, if there were no adjacent player vehicles, the peg moves to an enemy vehicle, in this case, an SUV or the tank. And if there's more than one choice, like we have here, the players decide where the peg goes. If there were no valid choices, you instead return the enemy peg back to the supply. I had said that you can't have 2 enemy pegs on top of the same vehicle, but you can have more than one player peg on top. And if one or more player pegs are on a vehicle that gets wrecked, these move to the nearest vehicle with an available spot, even if the nearest vehicle isn't adjacent. Players are never eliminated in this game, so you will always find your way onto a vehicle, no matter how far away it is. And if there are several valid, equally close options, you decide which one to move to. Also, if both a player and an enemy peg are on a vehicle that just got wrecked, you move them to new vehicles in any order you like. Okay, well, with the ramming SUV action complete, that brings us to the take boost token action. With this action, you take 1 boost token from the supply and add it to the area beneath your board here. And you can have, at most, 3 boost tokens at any one time. The catch with this action is that once you take it, you cannot take another action that turn. So usually you'll want this to be your second action, because if it's your first action, you don't get a second. And that covers all the actions on the reference, but there is one other option known as a stunt action. To perform a stunt, check for any that are face up in this area, and at most there'll be 3 to choose from. And you can pick any of them to perform as long as you meet their condition here. For example, chain reaction requires you and 2 or more enemy SUVs to be in a straight line in any direction. As long as you're manning your vehicle, you can then perform this skill roll, and if you succeed, you complete the stunt, gaining the reward here. And these will often help you achieve your overall objective. Here, the furthest SUV in the chain becomes a wreck, and then you move it up to 2 spaces in any direction. If you have it land on the tank takes 1 damage, and the wreck returns to the supply. For each damage the tank takes, move its marker here 1 space to the right. After completing the stunt, you also collect 1 boost token from its card if you have space for it, and then if all the boost tokens have been collected from it, you flip the stunt over. Now it can no longer be attempted during this game. We'll see how more stunts are revealed a little later, but I'll mention that the level 3 stunts do not provide boost tokens as a reward. Instead, these never flip over after they're used. They can be performed as many times as the players like. Just keep in mind, no matter the level of the stunt, each one you attempt still uses up one of your 2 actions for your turn. In addition to your actions, each starting player vehicle and each character has a special power that gives you unique abilities you can use anytime they'd be valid. But you'll notice, once you take over an enemy SUV, you lose your unique vehicle ability. So those are all of the actions. And after you've taken 2, or just 1, if you only want to perform 1, you move to the next step of your turn, rolling the enemy die. Now, if you flip over your player reference, you'll find all the possible results on the die and how they work right here. So let's go over them together. This is the enemy die, and this symbol represents the enemy SUVs, and it means that each one of them on the highway activates in what is known as the resolution order. This order starts in the top left-hand corner and goes all the way down. Then you go to the next column and go all the way down again, column by column. Now, as soon as you come to each related piece, in this case enemy SUVs, you resolve them. When resolved, this might move the SUV to a new location, but just make sure you never resolve a piece more than once per roll. So in our example here, this SUV would resolve first, then this one, and this one. When you activate an enemy SUV with this die, if it's adjacent to a player vehicle, it slams into it, dealing 3 damage. If there's more than one player vehicle adjacent to it, it will pick the active player. Or if the active player isn't one of those options, the players decide which one it targets. Anytime a player is dealt damage in the game, they perform a skill roll using their defense, and every dot rolled reduces the damage by 1. However, if you're not in your vehicle, your character can't do any defensive driving to reduce the damage, and only the defense of the vehicle itself is considered. So if Dom is behind the wheel, he'd roll 4 dice, but if he's outside of his car, he only rolls 2 for the 2 defense on his vehicle board. So with a roll like this, instead of dealing 3 damage, the enemy SUV only deals 2, but we could of course spend a boost token and reduce the damage to 0. Keep in mind, if the same car gets slammed by different SUVs, you roll your defense for each one. If the enemy SUV that is activating isn't adjacent to a player vehicle, you instead move it 1 space towards the active player's vehicle, no matter where their player peg happens to be. If it has an option between moves, the enemy SUV will try to be on the same row or column as its target. So for example, in this case, it could move closer by going here or here, but this puts it in the same row as its target, so that's where it will go. If the active player has no car, maybe it was destroyed and the player is currently on top of another vehicle, the SUV won't move. It also won't move if the only spaces it could move to won't bring it closer to its target. Next up, we have the enemy peg symbol, and if this is rolled, again, in resolution order, all enemy pegs will activate 1 at a time. Each one will either damage, brawl, or move, and you check to see which one of those it performs in that order. And as soon as it does any one of those things, that peg is finished activating and you move on to the next one. So first, check to see if it's on top of a player's vehicle. If so, it does 2 damage and the affected player then does a defense skill roll, remembering that if they're not currently in their vehicle, they only roll as many dice as the defense symbol showing on their vehicle's board. Now, if an enemy peg is not on top of a player vehicle, it instead activates by brawling if it's on top of an enemy vehicle with a player peg. This simply knocks that player off that vehicle onto the next closest vehicle with an available space. Now, if you have a situation where the enemy peg can't damage or brawl, instead check to see if it's on a vehicle adjacent to a player vehicle. If so, it moves to the player vehicle, targeting the active player if possible. Remember though, at most, only 1 enemy peg can be on each vehicle. So if there's no available slot, the enemy peg doesn't move. It also does nothing if there are no adjacent vehicles or if none of the previous options were possible. So in a case like this peg wouldn't do anything. Moving on. If you roll this skull, you resolve enemy cards. Now there won't be any face up in this area at the start of the game, but I've set some here just to be able to show you some examples. First, after rolling this, if there's a card in this 3rd spot, you now discard it. Then, whether there was or wasn't, you move all the face-up cards 1 space to the right. If one enters the space labeled as Activate, you resolve any text within its red boxed area. Then you draw a new card from the top of the deck and place it into the first space here and resolve all of the effects above the red box. These are known as the reveal effects, and you perform them in their printed order. If you ever run out of cards in the enemy deck and need to draw a new one, just shuffle its discard pile into a new enemy deck. At the very beginning of the game, the first time that you have to draw an enemy card, there won't be anything here to discard or move over, so just draw a card into this position and resolve its reveal effects. The effects of the enemy cards are explained on them, but I'll just mention that if one tells you to add enemy SUVs to the board and the indicated spaces are already occupied, just place them in the nearest empty space in the direction specified. Also, if you're told to add more SUVs to the board than are in the supply, just add what you have remaining in the resolution order and ignore the rest. Finally, we have these two sides of the die, and in both cases, two things happen in order. First, you move the main enemy, in this case, the tank, either one space north or one space south. And then you resolve this symbol just as you would if you had rolled this side, which we already know how to do. So let's just look at moving the tank. The tank itself takes up 4 spaces at a time, so any of these spaces are considered to be adjacent to it. When it moves north or south, shift it 1 row in that direction, so this is how it would move south. Here I've set up an example to show you what happens if any vehicles occupy the spaces the tank is going to move into. First, they're pushed 1 space in the same direction, pushing any vehicles they would go into. So all of these will shift down like this, making room for the tank to perform its move. None of the vehicles further down suffer any damage. But if one of the first ones pushed was a player vehicle, it takes 4 damage and would make a defense roll as usual. So in this case, the only vehicle this applies to is the black one here. Here I've set up a situation where the tank is going to move north. Now if the tank moves directly onto a wrecked vehicle, the tank takes 1 damage and the wreck is removed. On the other hand, if the tank pushes another vehicle onto a wreck, the wreck is also removed, but no damage is dealt by the wreck. And now with room made, the tank can move up. If there's no empty spaces for the pushed vehicles to move into, let's say for example our tank now needed to move south, here we don't see enough wrecks or empty spaces to move into, and that means the tank won't move at all. And that also means it doesn't damage any player vehicles that might have been directly in the space it was meant to move into. And those are all of the enemy die faces, and many of them can result in damage being done to your vehicle. So we should probably take a moment and see what kind of problems that can cause. If damage to your vehicle ever causes your strength cube to move off the bottom of your board, your player vehicle is destroyed and becomes a wreck. After moving any pegs off of it and flipping it over, if you were behind the wheel, you move to the top of the nearest car, and if you have options, just pick the one that you want. But don't forget, you can always hijack an enemy SUV later, making this side active. And with that, we now know how to take a turn. First, you take up to 2 actions, and then you roll and resolve the enemy die. When your turn is over, you flip your character board to this exhausted side, as a reminder that you cannot take another turn this round. And if you have a character ability that can be used during another player's turn, it's still available to you, and you'll find it on this side as well, along with your defense stats. Once every player's board has been flipped to its exhausted side, the round is over, and now you perform the following steps listed here on your reference. First, one at a time in resolution order, move each wreck and unmanned player vehicle. Wrecks are moved 4 spaces to the west. Any enemy SUV or player vehicles in its path are destroyed and returned to the supply. This also means that any enemy or player pegs that might be on those cars should be moved following the normal rules. Now, the wreck itself is not destroyed by this, so that means it can move through and destroy several vehicles. If it moves off the board, it is also returned to the supply, but otherwise, wrecks after moving will stay in the space they landed in. If you come to an unmanned player vehicle, here Dominic has jumped out on top of this SUV, or perhaps you come to a vehicle that was abandoned by another player because they hijacked an SUV, those will always move just 1 space west if there's an empty space behind them. If the space is not empty, then they'll stay put. If one of these unmanned player vehicles moves off the edge of the board, then they're considered destroyed and can be removed from the game. With all the required wrecks and cars moved, you now slide each stunt card, whether face up or face down, 1 space to the left. And I'm pretending it's a little later in the game we have more of these stunts on the board to show you how this works. If any of the stunts leave the board, return any boost tokens on them to the supply and then just discard this. Then draw the next stunt card, if any remain, and set it into the eastmost spot, adding any boost tokens to it as required. If you ever run out of stunts to draw from the deck, the other cards will still advance as normal, but no new ones are added to the board. With the round complete, players now flip their character boards back over, and a new round begins. And rounds will continue like this until the game ends in one of 3 possible ways. If the players achieve the objective of the scenario, which in this case is destroying the tank by reducing its strength to 0, then the game immediately ends and the players all win. Or instead, if the players successfully perform the level 3 stunt action, the reward there indicates that the players also immediately win. And finally, if the level 3 stunt card moves off the road board during the end of round, the game ends immediately and the team loses. You ran out of time to destroy the tank. Don't forget, there are 2 other scenarios you can play, and those may have alternative lose conditions, so be sure to check their specific rule sheets when playing them. But otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play Fast and Furious Highway Heist. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. But until next time, thanks for watching.